So what were you told about your great-grandparents exactly?
Most of these are just tales, so I never verified them. I just heard about great grandparents that were interesting characters, and this would be on the Stagger side and the Cumberledge side. But my Aunt Edna and my Aunt Frances told me that one of our great grandparents followed the medicine doctor around as they made their rounds, and if the medicine doctor gave someone some medicine, they would get some of the medicine too and take twice as much. If it helps, they thought that twice as much might help them even more. Another great-grandparent was a redhead. And I guess the definition of a scoundrel, because from time to time he would bring another redhead baby home, give it to his wife and say, "This one's ours too." So the story is everyone in Mineral County, West Virginia that's redhead is related to that great-grandfather. Have another great-grandfather, and these may all be the same great-grandfather, I don't know. Have another great-grandfather that supposedly died in his late 80s. He was up in the top of an apple tree, and the story and the sort of the gossip around that was that he was in the top of an apple tree trying to peer into a young girl's bedroom. The other story about a great-grandparent, Civil War. And he was in, Kaiser changed hands many times during the Civil War. And so they had a prison there, and it was for prisoners of war. And he was put in as a prisoner of war because he refused to fight. Then the other side took over, liberated him, and he refused to fight for them too, so they put him back in. The story is he spent the entire Civil War in prison because he refused to fight. Of course, he lived to generate some interesting characters on down the line.
What do you know about your great-grandparents specifically?
Not much. And I just know I've heard stories about those four. And on my mother's side, here's the story. Her grandmother her great-grandmother came over on the boat. She was a twin. They're 100% Irish. And they twins in steerage coming over on the boat. And one of the twins died in her twin's arms. And they came into Baltimore. They became indentured servants, both the males and the females, and moved up into the Oakland, Maryland area. For those people, after they outdid their indentured servitude, there's people buried in Oakland, Maryland, but evidently they didn't do a real colorful life because they just produced Irish kids. I heard someone say once, when little kids weren't supposed to listen, that my mother was the first person to marry out of the Irish race when she married my father.
That's funny. Do you have any early remembrances like that of your mother and father, since you're the oldest?
The first thing I remember, this is strange because I know it's a memory, and I confirmed it with my mother later on. I remember a long room and white curtains blowing all in from open windows and blowing over me, and a storm. And my mother, I told my mother, I figured that would be the room where I died. But when I told my mother, she said, no, I was just probably 6 to 8 months old in a crib, and they had gone right next door to visit some friends on the naval base. I was born at Patuxent Naval Air Base. And a huge storm showed up right away, and they were afraid I would be scared, but I had scooted my crib over to the windows, and it was a long room with white chiffon curtains just blowing out over me, and laughing and having a great time with the storm. I think I remember that. I remember that we lived in Kaiser in an old mansion that was torn down after we lived there, and there was a patio out back. I can remember aluminum glasses with alcoholic beverages, and my father was smoking at that time. I remember people laughing. I remember my mother laughing and dancing. I remember them being really happy. And I remember my first trip to Washington, D.C., as we drove into Washington after he was elected. First thing I remember is driving to Washington, and I got to see, as you came into Washington, the Capitol and the monument, and I remember saying, that looks like a picture postcard. In terms of early memories, only the things that I've been told. When my father was a naval navigator in the Naval Air Force at Patuxent Naval Air Base. They had friends, of course, and he was lieutenant commander. So he was scheduled to take a flight out when my mother was full-term pregnancy, and she went into labor, and his friend volunteered to take the flight out. And so when I was born, that flight didn't come back. That's always been the story I was told. I never verified that. But I may not have had a father had I not decided to be born on January the 12th, 1945.
What other early memories do you remember just in general of your childhood?
I remember that I met probably about 4 or 5 years with my grandmother Staggers and 2 aunts, my Aunt Edna and my Aunt Frances. My father had bought that home for my grandmother to protect her from Jake Staggers, who was a great legend in his time as sort of a outlaw running moonshine, but he was abusive to her. So my father rescued her, got her a home. My 2 aunts lived there, and all of them had been school teachers. The story was that my grandfather kidnapped my grandmother because she was way above his station in life, and she was the only woman in the whole valley that had been educated. So he thought, well, I don't want anyone else to get educated, I'll just take her. And my great uncle Willie told me that he muffled the horses while my grandfather stole her. And of course, when she'd been with him overnight, she was sort of sullied produce at that time, and so she did marry Jake and had lots of kids, and her favorite, I think, was my father, and he got the younger 3, the 2 aunts I lived with, Frances and Edna and John, to college, because he was the first one who went to college. He played football. But what I remember about them, there was no TV, there was no real radio shows that we listened to. I just heard tales. I spent time alone daydreaming and making up fantasies and entertaining for older people. I learned how to do soft shoe and tap dance and piano, and they would take me places and have me perform as a little girl in tutus, and I was their little princess because since I lived there with them, they dressed me every day. They did my hair. I didn't know how to dress myself until I was older. And these 3 educators really spent a lot of time feeding back into me, and I think that's been a lot of my success in terms of studying. My relentless thirst for knowledge and seeking knowledge is there's always out there something for me to learn and know, because there they were, the teachers that I went to school, and Edna was a 6th grade teacher, and Frances was a high school French teacher, and I got to have both of them for classes. But my grandmother was a lady, and she inherited a land grant in Monongalia County from King George. So that makes us, as my husband that I'm married to now, he is entitled to be called a gentleman, and I'm entitled to be called Lady Margaret as a land grant owner. And she knew how to weave, knit, tat. I can remember a spinning wheel being in the front room, and she taught me how to knit, weave, tat, embroider. She said, because a lady knows how to do these things.